Before we begin, close your eyes for a moment. It is September 80 BC. The Persian army has just marched through the smoking ruins of Athens. The greatest city in the Greek world is ash and blackened stone. Xerxes the First, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, sits on a golden throne on the Attic shoreline and looks out at the water before him. In that water, 1,207 Persian warships sit waiting. The largest naval force ever assembled in the ancient world. And somewhere in the narrow straits ahead, a Greek fleet of 371 ships waits for them. This is not a story about numbers. This is a story about the one man who understood something that nobody else in the ancient world had yet figured out. That the ocean itself could be a weapon. This is the Battle of Salamis. To understand what happened in those narrow straits in September 480 BC, you have to go back 3 days. Back to the smoking ruins of Athens. Back to the moment when everything looked completely lost. Thermopylae had fallen. The 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians were dead. The mountain pass that had held the Persian army for 3 days was open. Xerxes had marched his 2 million soldiers south through central Greece virtually unopposed. City after city either surrendered or was abandoned. The Boeotians, the people of Thebes, had already switched sides, offering earth and water to Persia in submission. The road to Athens was open and Xerxes walked it without resistance. But when the Persian vanguard reached Athens, they found something that made no sense to them. The city was empty, not damaged, not burned, not looted, just empty. Every single Athenian citizen, 30,000 people, had vanished. No women cooking in the agora, no children in the streets, no old men sitting in doorways. Nothing. The most populated city in Greece had simply ceased to contain people. This was the work of one man, Themistocles, the Athenian politician and naval strategist who had spent the previous 8 years preparing for exactly this moment. When the news of Thermopylae's fall arrived in Athens, Themistocles had already begun the evacuation. Using the Oracle of Delphi as political cover, the oracle had cryptically advised that the wooden wall would save Athens, and Themistocles had argued brilliantly that the wooden wall meant the wooden hulls of the Athenian fleet. He convinced the Athenian assembly to evacuate the entire civilian population by sea. 30,000 Athenians crossed the Saronic Gulf by ship, by fishing boat, by anything that floated, to the island of Salamis and the shores of the Peloponnese. Mothers with infants, old men who had never left their neighborhood, young men who would fight tomorrow, ferrying their families to safety today. The ancient sources describe the chaos and grief of that evacuation. Families splitting up, people weeping on the shore, dogs running along the beach as their owners boarded ships and pulled away. One ancient story says that the dog of the Athenian statesman Xanthippus swam alongside his master's ship all the way across to Salamis before collapsing and dying on the beach from exhaustion. The Athenians buried the dog where he fell. They called the headland Cynosema, the dog's tomb. This detail, preserved across 2,500 years, tells you something about the emotional weight of what that evacuation meant to the people living it. Xerxes arrived in an empty city and burned it anyway. The Acropolis, the early Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the treasury buildings, all of it reduced to ash and blackened stone. It was a deliberate act of symbolic destruction, the capital of Greek civilization burned by the Persian king who believed himself a god. Xerxes watched it burn from the shore and considered his invasion essentially complete. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong was floating in the straits of Salamis 3 kilometers away. The Greek fleet was in trouble, not from the Persians, not yet, but from itself. After Thermopylae, the Greek naval alliance that had been holding together since the beginning of the invasion was beginning to crack. The fleet was anchored in the Bay of Phaleron and then moved to the Straits of Salamis, and the commanders of the various city-state contingents were arguing furiously about what to do next. The Peloponnesian commanders, Corinth, Aegina, Megara, and others, wanted to sail south immediately and defend the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow land bridge connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of Greece. The Spartans were already building a wall across the isthmus on land. The Peloponnesian argument was logical from a purely self-interested point of view. If the fleet retreated to the isthmus, they would be defending their own homelands. Salamis was not their home. Athens was already burned. What exactly were they fighting for here? Themistocles understood what these men did not. Or rather, He understood something they refused to accept. The isthmus was a death trap for the Greek fleet. In open water south of Salamis, the Persian numerical advantage would be overwhelming. The Persian fleet of 1,207 warships could simply surround and envelop the Greek fleet of 371 from every direction. Open water was where Persian numbers would crush Greek discipline exactly as open ground would have crushed the Spartan phalanx at Thermopylae. But the straits of Salamis were different. The strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland was narrow, at its tightest point less than 1.5 kilometers wide. In that constrained water, the Persian fleet could not spread out, could not use its numbers, could not flank. It would be forced to fight in exactly the kind of bottleneck that the Greeks needed. Thermopylae had been a land bottleneck. Salamis was a water bottleneck. The principle was identical. Leonidas had understood it on land. Themistocles understood it at sea. But Themistocles had a problem. He could not force the Peloponnesian commanders to stay. The overall commander of the Greek fleet was the Spartan admiral Eurybiades, a compromise choice who was respected by all sides, but who leaned toward the Peloponnesian position of withdrawal. Without Eurybiades, the alliance fell apart. Without the alliance, there was no fleet. Without the fleet, Greece was finished. The debates in the Greek War Council were reportedly furious. Themistocles argued his position with the passionate urgency of a man who could see exactly what was going to happen and could not make anyone else see it. One ancient account by Plutarch describes a Corinthian commander telling Themistocles that a man without a city had no right to tell men with cities what to do. A brutal reference to the fact that Athens had been burned and Themistocles was technically a man without a home. Themistocles reportedly replied that Athens had 200 warships and 40,000 armed men, and that was more of a city than most people would ever have. He was not a man to be silenced by insults. But the Peloponnesian commanders were close to leaving. Eurybiades was wavering. The fleet might actually sail south and abandon the Salamis position. And if it did, Themistocles knew the war was over. So Themistocles did something extraordinary. Something that would either save Greece or destroy him personally. Something that even today, 2,500 years later, makes historians simultaneously admire and question the ethics of the man. He sent a secret message to Xerxes. The messenger was a man named Sisinus, Themistocles' own slave and the tutor of his children. Sisinus was rowed across to the Persian fleet in a small boat at night and delivered a message directly to Xerxes' admirals. The message, according to Herodotus, said something like this, that Themistocles, the Athenian commander, was secretly sympathetic to Persia, that the Greek commanders were divided and planning to flee, and that if Xerxes moved his fleet immediately to block both exits of the Salamis Strait, he could trap the Greek fleet and destroy it in one engagement before it could escape. Read that again. Themistocles told Xerxes exactly where the Greek fleet was, told him it was planning to flee, and invited him to trap it. Was this treason? Was this genius? Was it both simultaneously? Themistocles knew something about Xerxes that he was counting on absolutely. He knew that Xerxes wanted a decisive naval battle. He knew that Xerxes' admirals would tell him this was an opportunity to end the war in one engagement. And he knew that if Xerxes moved his fleet to block the exits of the Salamis Strait, to trap the Greeks, he would actually be doing exactly what Themistocles needed him to do. He would be bringing his 1,207 warships into a narrow space where they could not maneuver. He would be walking his fleet into the exact same trap that the Medes had walked into at Thermopylae. And there was one more benefit to the message. The moment the Persian fleet moved to block the strait exits, the Greek commanders would have no choice but to fight. There would be nowhere to retreat to. The Peloponnesians who wanted to sail south would find the southern exit blocked by Persian warships. The debate in the Greek War Council would be over because there would be nothing left to debate. The only option left would be to fight, in exactly the narrow water Themistocles had chosen. Themistocles had used Xerxes as a tool to solve his own alliance problem. He had manipulated the most powerful king in the ancient world into doing his tactical bidding without Xerxes ever knowing it was happening. The night before the battle, Xerxes moved his fleet. The Persian warships, 1,207 of them, began moving through the darkness to block both exits of the Salamis Strait. The Egyptian squadron, 200 warships, went around the western end of Salamis Island to block the western exit. The main Persian fleet, moved to block the eastern entrance to the strait. The Greek fleet was surrounded. The Greek War Council learned what had happened at dawn. The Persian fleet had moved in the night. The Persians were now blocking both exits. There was nowhere to go. The Peloponnesian commanders who had been arguing for retreat sat in silence, the argument rendered irrelevant by geography. Themistocles had his battle, in his strait, on his terms. There is one more detail from that night that ancient sources preserve, and that tells you something important about the psychological dimension of what was about to happen. The exiled Athenian statesman Aristides, a political enemy of Themistocles who had been ostracized from Athens years earlier, arrived at the Greek fleet during the night by small boat, having slipped through the Persian cordon. He came directly to Themistocles, his old enemy, to tell him that the Persian fleet had completed its encirclement. The two men who had spent years as political opponents stood together in the darkness and understood that none of that mattered anymore. Aristides offered his services. Themistocles accepted them immediately. The day of the battle began before sunrise. The morning of the Battle of Salamis, September 25th, for 80 BC, though some historians place it on the 28th, began with the Greeks doing something the Persians did not expect. The Greek fleet began to backwater, to reverse slowly toward the western end of the strait, as if retreating. The Persian commanders, watching from the eastern entrance, saw the Greek ships apparently backing away and interpreted it as fear, as panic, as exactly the kind of Greek collapse they had been told to expect by Themistocles' message the night before. The Greek fleet was running. The Persian fleet surged forward into the strait to catch them. This is the moment everything changed. The Strait of Salamis at the point of the battle was roughly 1 kilometer wide. The Persian fleet of 1,207 warships, far too many to fit in this space, began pressing into the narrow water, the ships in the rear pushing forward, the ships in the front being compressed into an increasingly tight mass of hulls and oars and rigging. The Persian ships were tall, high-sided warships designed for the open sea where their height gave them an advantage in boarding actions. But in the narrow strait, their height worked against them. They were difficult to maneuver quickly. They needed space to turn, and they had none. The Greek triremes, lower, faster, built for exactly this kind of work, stopped their feigned retreat and turned. The Athenian ships on the left wing of the Greek fleet struck first. The trireme was the most sophisticated warship the ancient world had ever produced, a narrow vessel powered by 170 oarsmen arranged in 3 overlapping banks, capable of accelerating to extraordinary speed over short distances. Its primary weapon was its bronze ram, a 3-pronged bronze protrusion at the waterline of the bow, designed to be driven at full speed into the hull of an enemy ship below the waterline, opening a hole through which the sea would pour in within minutes. The Athenian left wing drove into the Persian right flank at full ramming speed. The bronze rams punched through Persian hulls with catastrophic effect. The tall Persian ships, unable to maneuver in the compressed space, could not turn quickly enough to avoid the Greek rams. A Persian ship that was rammed at the waterline had minutes before it capsized. The crews, most of them from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Ionia, peoples who had been conquered by Persia and pressed into naval service, could not swim. When their ships went down, they went down with them. The Persian formation, if it could still be called a formation, began to collapse. The ships in the rear were still pushing forward, not knowing what was happening at the front. The ships in the front were being rammed, capsizing, their wreckage blocking the passage of ships behind them. Persian warships began colliding with each other as they tried to turn and found themselves hitting their own fleet. The narrow strait, which had been Themistocles' chosen weapon, was doing exactly what he had calculated it would do, turning Persian numbers from an advantage into a liability. The Greek right wing was fighting the Phoenician contingent, the best sailors in the Persian fleet. This wing was commanded by the Spartans under Eurybiades, and it was harder going. The Phoenicians were professional sailors of extraordinary skill, and they gave the Spartan-led right wing a difficult fight. But even here the geography told against them. They could not use their superior seamanship in water this confined. On the hillsides above the battle, Xerxes watched from his golden throne. He had set the throne up on the slopes of Mount Aigaleos on the Attic shore, positioned so he could observe the entire battle, surrounded by his scribes who were recording the names of commanders who distinguished themselves so they could be rewarded later. The ancient sources tell us that at the beginning of the battle, when the Persian fleet surged into the strait, Xerxes believed he was watching a victory unfold. He was watching a disaster. As the morning progressed, the scale of what was happening became impossible to misread, even from the hillside. Persian ships were going down in extraordinary numbers. The strait was becoming choked with wreckage, with floating bodies, with abandoned oars and broken rigging. The crews of capsized Persian ships, unable to swim, were drowning in the water below the throne where Xerxes sat watching. Greek sailors who could swim were killing Persian sailors in the water. The narrow geography of the strait meant that the Persian ships that had not yet engaged were being forced to watch their fleet destroyed without being able to reach the battle to help. There is one moment from the Battle of Salamis that ancient sources preserve that tells you everything about how the Greeks fought that day. The island of Citylea, a small rocky island in the strait, had been occupied the previous night by a force of Persian soldiers, placed there by Xerxes to kill any Greek sailors whose ships were wrecked near it. During the battle, the Athenian statesman Aristides, the former enemy of Themistocles who had arrived by night boat, landed a force of Athenian hoplites on Citylea and killed every Persian soldier on the island. While the naval battle raged in the strait, Aristides was methodically eliminating the Persian insurance policy. Every angle covered, every contingency addressed. This was Themistocles' battle down to its last detail. By midday, the Persian fleet was in full retreat. The 200 Egyptian ships that had gone around the western end of Salamis Island to block the western exit had never been engaged in the main battle. When they heard the sounds of defeat coming from the strait, they withdrew. The Phoenician contingent, the best sailors Persia had, was broken. The Ionian Greeks who had been fighting in the Persian fleet began surrendering or switching sides, some of them rowing their ships directly to the Greek line and offering their services. The Battle of Salamis was over in a single day. Xerxes sat on his throne above the strait and watched his fleet destroyed. The scribes around him who had been recording the names of distinguished commanders had nothing left to write. The greatest naval force ever assembled in the ancient world had been broken in one morning by a fleet 1/3 its size, in a strait 1 kilometer wide. The Persian casualties were catastrophic. Ancient sources give numbers that range from implausible to staggering. Herodotus suggests over 200 Persian ships were sunk. The Greek losses were approximately 40 ships. The ratio of losses tells the entire story of what happened in the strait that morning. Xerxes made his decision quickly. He would return to Persia. The fear that drove the decision was not just military, it was personal. Themistocles, having won the battle, immediately sent another message to Xerxes. This message said, falsely, that the Greek fleet was planning to sail north and destroy the bridges of boats over the Hellespont, cutting off Xerxes' retreat back to Asia. This was not true. The Greek commanders had no such plan and would not have agreed to one. But Themistocles wanted Xerxes gone from Greece, and the fastest way to make that happen was to make Xerxes afraid for his own safety. It worked. Xerxes began his retreat within days of the battle. He left his best general, Mardonius, in Greece with an army of 300,000 soldiers to continue the land campaign. But Xerxes himself, the god king who had whipped the sea and chained the ocean, began the long walk back toward Persia. He crossed the Hellespont on a single ship. His bridge of boats had been damaged in storms and disappeared back into his empire. He never returned to Greece. The land campaign continued for another year, ending at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, where the remaining Persian land forces under Mardonius were destroyed by a Greek army led by the Spartan general Pausanias. The Persian invasion of Greece was over completely, but it was Salamis that broke it. Thermopylae had bought the time. Salamis had used that time perfectly. In one morning in a 1 kilometer wide strait, a Greek fleet 1/3 the size of its enemy destroyed the Persian naval campaign so completely that the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen turned around and went home. Think about what that means. The Persian Empire at its peak stretched from India to Egypt, from the frozen steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean. It commanded the resources of a dozen conquered civilizations. It could field armies of millions. And it was stopped, permanently stopped, in a narrow strait off a small Greek island by 371 ships crewed by freemen who had voted on the decision to fight. The same democracy that Themistocles had used to convince Athens to build those 200 warships. The same system of governance that said ordinary citizens had the right to make decisions about their own fate had just defeated the largest autocratic empire on earth. The men rowing those triremes were not slaves, not conscripts, not subjects. They were citizens. They had chosen to be there. The ideas that Salamis preserved, democracy, philosophy, the concept of individual rights, the radical notion that human beings could govern themselves, traveled from Athens to Rome, from Rome to Renaissance Europe, from Renaissance Europe to the founding documents of modern nations. Every democracy that exists today carries a thread that runs back through history to a narrow strait, where a smaller fleet of free men chose to turn and fight rather than run. Themistocles himself did not end well. The man who saved Greece was ostracized from Athens within a decade of Salamis, accused of corruption and collaboration with Persia, the cruelest irony in Greek political history. He eventually fled to Persia, where Xerxes the First, the son of Xerxes, gave him a province to govern. The man who destroyed the Persian fleet lived out his days as a Persian governor. He died around 459 BC, some ancient sources say by his own hand, unable to bring himself to fulfill a Persian request to campaign against Greece. The man who saved Western civilization died in exile, in the empire he had defeated. But the strait is still there. The island of Salamis is still there. The narrow water between them, where 371 ships turned the direction of history, is still there. Unchanged by 2,500 years, still the same kilometer of sea that it was on that September morning when the rams went in and the Persian Empire began its long walk home. A stone inscription was placed near the site of the battle in the years that followed. It read simply, "Here the Greeks broke the power of Persia and saved their cities." Not a poem this time. Not 8 words carved by a poet. Just a statement of fact, plain and permanent. Here, this water, this narrow place, they held, and the world kept sailing because they did.